Hello, this is Mr. Everton, and this is our second video on ancient Greece. Last time we talked about Greek geography. We talked about how Greece was made up of independent city-states. So it wasn't one empire, it was a bunch of independent city-states with their own governments who competed against each other, but they also shared a common culture. We're going to talk more about that culture today. We also talked about how Greece had a lack of arable land, which means that they couldn't farm very easily. They didn't have enough farmland to meet their needs. And so that led Greece to trade and to form colonies. Today we're going to talk about Greek mythology. So please make sure you have your notes packet out, turn to page 5.2. And by the end of the notes, you need to be prepared to write a good substantive answer to this question. How did Greek mythology affect Greece? So let's start by defining Greek mythology, establishing what it is. What was Greek mythology? Well, it's a polytheistic religion. Remember, polytheism, we've talked about it before. A polytheistic religion is a religion that believes in more than one god or goddess, and the Greeks had dozens of gods and goddesses. Here you can see an illustration of a few of the most important. And Greek mythology tried to explain phenomenon in the world that the Greeks saw and were confused by. It tried to explain natural phenomenon, and it tried to explain human behavior. I'm going to go through a few of the most important Greek gods and goddesses. We're not going to cover all of them, but there are about 6 that you need to know. And we're going to talk about how each of these individual gods or goddesses helps to explain a natural or human phenomenon. So first, there's Zeus. Zeus is the most powerful of all the gods and goddesses. He's the father of many of the other gods and goddesses, and he was believed to be the king of the gods and goddesses. He's also the god of thunder and lightning. The Greeks would explain the natural phenomenon of thunder and lightning by saying that Zeus was hurling lightning bolts from high up on Mount Olympus. Another natural phenomenon that is explained by Greek mythology is the sun. This is the Greek god Apollo, who is the god of the sun and also of music. And you can see here Apollo has been painted in a chariot. The Greeks, one version of this myth is that Apollo would ride a chariot across the sky every day, and that would explain the phenomenon of the sun traveling across the sky. Now, if you look in Apollo's left hand, he's also holding a musical instrument, a Greek musical instrument called a lyre. And so he was the god of both the sun and also of music. You can see the influence of Greek mythology today in things like this sign for the famous Apollo Theater in Harlem in New York City. This is an older picture on the marquee. You can see Duke Ellington and his band were coming to play. The Apollo Theater has been host to many important, famous American musicians, and they named themselves Apollo after the Greek god of music. Apollo's twin sister is named Artemis, and she is the goddess of the moon and of hunting. So, you can see the fact that the Apollo and Artemis are twin brother and sister. You can see that the Greeks recognized a connection between the sun and the moon. And they gave the sun a male figure and the moon a female figure. Now, Greek mythology can also be used to explain human nature. The Greek gods and goddesses strongly resembled real people and believable human beings. They would have arguments with each other. They would get into fights. They would fall in love with each other. So because of these qualities, Greek myths were able to help explain human nature. This goddess is Hera. She was the wife of Zeus and the goddess of marriage and childbirth. And many of the myths that feature Hera show her being incredibly jealous because her husband Zeus was cheating on her, running down to Earth and having affairs with mortal women. And so she's frequently depicted as being incredibly jealous. Another goddess that helps explain human nature is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. A lot of myths about Aphrodite talk about her marriage to another god who she didn't care for, and how she would frequently have affairs with another god, Ares, the god of war. You can also see this painting of Aphrodite is a depiction of Aphrodite from several thousand years later in Italy. Greek mythology has had a lasting influence on European culture. This painting was done in Italy about 2,000 years later. And you can see the influence of Greek culture, also Greek religion, also in the naming of products and advertising. Here we see a line of olive oil skincare products that they've named after the Greek goddess of love because they want to associate it with beauty and making yourself desirable. And then finally, there's Athena, who is the Greek goddess of wisdom. According to myth, she sprung fully formed, fully grown from Zeus's head. He was having a splitting headache, and they split his head open, and Athena stepped out. Athena was associated with wisdom, so it makes sense that she would have been, born in this way. A lot of the Greek gods and goddesses feature in the poetry of an important Greek writer named Homer. Here you can see a bust of what Homer may have looked like. But Homer was a legendary Greek poet, which means legendary means that we don't 100% know that he existed. We don't have enough evidence to really say for sure. However, we do know that a lot of the Greeks talked about Homer and gave him credit for writing a couple of epic poems, really long poems called the Iliad and the Odyssey. And those poems tell the story of an event called the Trojan War, which we do have some archaeological evidence did happen. And it's the story of how the Greek city-states went across the Aegean Sea and fought a war against the city of Troy. Now, Homer's poetry, the Iliad, here's a painting from the Iliad. The Iliad tells the story of one episode from the Trojan War. And the Odyssey tells the story of a soldier from the Trojan War named Odysseus trying to get home and how the adventures and the obstacles that he runs into on his way home. Here you can see Odysseus tied up to the mast of the ship. All of this would have a really strong impact on Greece. Homer's poetry was central to Hellenic culture. All the different city-states were familiar with these two poems. They all knew them quite well, could tell the stories from these poems. And Homer's poetry helped to unite the Greek city-states in some ways. It helped to give them connections to each other. Also, Homer's poetry would go on to have a really important impact on Western literature, European literature. Homer's poetry was written in Greek, which was the shared language of the different city-states. It focused on some of the Greek gods and goddesses that I've talked about. For example, in the Odyssey, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, tries to help Odysseus get home. In the Iliad, Aphrodite takes sides with Troy against the Greeks. And it also tells the story of a shared history that the city-states have in common. So Greek mythology, in many ways, helped to connect the different city-states to each other. Also, it's important to note that the different city-states had their own favorite gods and goddesses. We call them patron gods and goddesses. For example, the city-state of Thebes had the patron god of Apollo. The city-state of Pylos had the patron goddess of Artemis. Corinth had the patron god of Poseidon, who is the Greek god of the sea. Athens had the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And Sparta had the god of Ares, the god of war. So city-states had a patron god or goddess, and they would build a temple to that god or goddess. Here you can see the Athenian temple, the Parthenon, which was built to the goddess Athena. And the place where the temple is built in the polis is called the Acropolis. It's the highest elevated part of the polis, and it's where the temple built to the city's patron would be located. So to summarize, Greek mythology is a polytheistic religion that helps to explain nature and human life. Greek mythology created a shared culture between the city-states that helped to connect the city-states to each other. And Greek myths have helped to shape Western culture. They continue to influence Western culture to this day. Thanks very much for watching. Next video, we'll start talking about Athens and Sparta and their politics.